Hello, everybody. My name is Marion Foucault, and I am the director of UC Berkeley's Social Science Matrix. And I am absolutely delighted to welcome you to our panel today. We will be discussing Darieck Scott's new book, Keeping It Unreal, which explores how the aesthetics of Black power in fantasy genres challenges white supremacy and anti-Blackness. Through a combination of personal recollection and theoretical consideration, Professor Scott gives us new tools to think about the relationship between fantastical genres and reality. We would like to thank our co-sponsors, the Department of African American Studies and the Berkeley Center for New Media. And of course, I want to thank the Matrix team, Chuck, Eva, and especially Julia for really putting together the whole thing. Today's event is part of our Author Meets Critics series, which features critically engaged discussions about recent books by faculty and alumni in our social science division. So as always, I begin by mentioning a few upcoming events. Next Thursday evening, we will be having a Matrix on Point event about the most recent round of Supreme Court decisions entitled The Court and the People. So join us for a deep dive into criminal procedure, abortion rights, and Native American sovereignty. On November 9, we will be having a discussion of Sandra Eder's book from Gender and Women's Studies, from History, How the Clinic Made Gender. And on December 2nd, we will be having a discussion on myth and misinformation with Berkeley scholars from the social sciences and humanities. All of them study the ways that myths about marginalized groups circulate in society. So we have many more exciting events. You can just find them, and both past and future. You can find them on our website if you haven't already. Now, I would like to introduce our moderator, Greg. Greg Niemeyer is a data artist and professor of media innovation in the Department of Art Practice at UC Berkeley. He's the former director and co-founder of the Berkeley Center for New Media. His work is data-driven. Large data sets and data streams are raw materials for visual and sonic experiences. His work theorizes data as mirrors, reflecting to us what we don't see about our essential resources, air, water, care, from novel points of view. These patterns hold the hope that we can learn something new about what is to come, and that we can evolve from the impossible present to more possible futures. So without further ado, I now turn it over to Greg and to the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne, and thank you for welcoming us here. I also would like to thank Julia Zizek again for organizing this panel so thoughtfully and carefully. And today it's my honor to be here and moderate and be a mirror and reflect all the great things back to you all. And I'm going to introduce our three participants in the panel. And the first one, of course, is Ula Taylor. Ula Taylor is a professor and chair of undergrad studies in the Department of African American Studies and African Diaspora Studies at UC Berkeley. She earned her doctorate in American history from UC Santa Barbara. She's the author of The Promise of Patriarchy, Women and the Nation of Islam, The Veiled Garvey, The Life and Times of Amy Jacques Garvey, co-author of Panther, A Pictorial History of the Black Panther Party, and The Story Behind the Film, and co-editor of Black California Dreaming, The Crisis of California, African American Communities. For this work, she received the Liberty Legacy Foundation Award, the Letitia Woods Brown Prize from the Association for Black Women Historians, and the honorable mention in the Darlene Clark Hine Awards. And I also asked all the panelists to introduce themselves by way of their superheroes, and kind of going with the theme of the lecture today and the book, of course. And so I'm proud to announce that we're not just among mortals here, we're among superheroes, and her superhero alter ego is, next slide, please. I have to do it. There's no superhero action for next slide is there, the bionic woman. And why the bionic woman? And that was very compelling because of the ear hustle, the stunning listening powers, which of course are a key, which are a key feature of any historian, right? So with that, we all have welcomed Ula Taylor, and let's give her a round of applause. The next panelist I'm going to introduce is Scott Bukatman, and he's a dear friend and colleague from Stanford and professor of film and media studies at Stanford University. I graduated from Stanford, so I remember walking through the halls and listening to the auditorium cracking up and laughing every time Scott gave lectures. It was very, very powerful, and everybody was kind of envious. How does he do it? Why is he so funny? And turns out you scaled this up now, and you have a whole department of people who make lectures like that. His work explores the way popular forms mediate between new technologies and human perceptual and bodily experience. His books include the classical Terminal Identity, the virtual subject in postmodern science fiction, Hellboy's World, Comics and Monsters on the Margins, and most recently, Black Panther, which was published by the University of Texas Press. His superhero alter ego is Superman. Because of his superpower of secret identity. And I don't think I'm revealing any secrets if I say your email is actually X-Body at Stanford. So that's another superpower reference right there. So please welcome Scott Bukatman. So finally, Darieck Scott is a professor of African American Studies at UC Berkeley. And he's the author of Keeping It Unreal, Black Queer Fantasy and Superhero Comics, which was published this year by NYU Press. And of course, this is the reason why we're all gathering here today. So congratulations on the publication. His book, Extravagant Objection, Blackness, Power and Sexuality in the African American Literary Imagination, also from NYU Press, was the winner of the 2011 Alan Bray Memorial Prize for Queer Studies of the Modern Language Association. His superhero alter ego, which we're all waiting for, is very powerful, is the Storm character from the Marvel Universe. So please join me in welcoming this amazing panel of superheroes and Professor Darieck Scott.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming out this afternoon and everybody on Zoom as well. And thanks to the Berkeley Center for New Media and my own Department of African American Studies for co-sponsoring this event. And also Julia and all the social science matrix people for putting this event together. And very warm thanks to Eula and Scott and Greg for their generosity in taking the time to read my book and respond to it today and talk with me about it today. So as an introduction, I'm going to talk about some of the central ideas of the book in two different ways. One of them sort of more autobiographical and the other more theoretical, and then just do a short reading from part of the introduction. So fantasy has always been an important part of my existence. And I think one of the reasons that's been the case is that I'm an Army brat and I moved around a lot as a child. So we moved around, you know, every 1, 2, or 3 years. We never stayed anywhere longer than 3 years. So in a sense, there was a way where I needed to kind of create a community of sorts in my own head. And so in this book, I was sort of trying to think about an account of the importance of fantasy, not just to me, but generally in how fantasy invests a lot of what our lives are involved in. So part of that begins with the definition that is we generally think of fantasy as an escape from reality, as not dealing with what needs to be done, or at best as something that is a plan for some future action, which would be a kind of utopian fantasy. And I was interested in thinking of fantasy not as an escape, but as an active engagement with reality. And also not seeing fantasy as only important if it is vouchsafed by some plan to do something in the future, but to think of it as an activity that happens in the now, that does something in the present, in us individually when we fantasize, and also when we fantasize collectively, which would involve going to comic book conventions together and engaging in communities of fans, flocking to superhero movies, Game of Thrones obsessions. All of these things are different ways in which we fantasize collectively. So all of that to me is a way of thinking about fantasy as transforming being. And I'll say more about that, especially in the theoretical sort of portion of the discussion. For me, the story, as it were, autobiographically begins when I first got interested in superhero comics, which is when I was living in what was then West Germany in the early 1970s. My father took me to a sort of weekly visit to the bookstore, the one bookstore on the Army base. And somewhere along the line, I saw, how do I get the image? Spacebar. Oh. I saw this comic on the shelf. So this is from 1973, a Wonder Woman comic. And I was drawn to and entranced by this image, and bought this comic, my little allowance, and that began my reading superhero comics. And of course, one of the reasons that I was drawn to it is because this is one of the few, probably the only actually, Black character that was on the cover of the comic books that I was looking at on that shelf that day. And also because of the beauty, the power of the Black figure who turns out to be Nubia, who was in the story of Wonder Woman. Those of you who know the story of Wonder Woman as a character began in the 1940s. And the story of how she gained her powers is that her mother was Queen of the Amazons, Hippolyta, and that she shaped her daughter out of the clay from Paradise Island, and the gods invested the clay figure with all these powers. So in this 1973 introduction of Nubia, they rebooted her origin to say, also Hippolyta shaped Diana out of this light-colored clay, and then Nubia shaped out of this dark-colored clay. So that was the story for why Nubia was there, and she had all of Wonder Woman's powers. And I was also drawn to what is obviously the problematic but very arresting leopard skin skirt that she's wearing, which she wears nowhere else other than this cover. The character only appeared 3 times. It was in 3 issues of Wonder Woman. Totally disappeared. Has had a revival 50 years later, or nearly 50 years later. Now there's maybe a comic and various other sort of iterations of the character who've suddenly appeared, because so people, it wasn't just me, but a lot of people seem to have had an attachment to that character. So when I think about what the meaning of this figure was for me, I think that a big part of how I made sense of the radically changed world and changing world that I was always living in, but certainly was changed for me at that time because we've been living in the United States. We moved to Germany. We're living in a place where people speak a different language. It's a different country, all those things. A way that I made sense of that was through the imagination that was sparked from reading superhero comics. And of course, in a way that's nonsensical, right? That is that superhero comics don't make sense of the world. They're totally about unreal worlds. They're totally, fanciful science. But comics do require imagination to engage with them. There's a fundamental aspect of the form of comics that requires your participation as a reader. That is, you have these panels with art and text, and they're divided by these blank gutters, and you as the reader have to engage in a way with the reading of the comic where you animate the figures in your own mind in the static tableau of the panel. You connect the panels one to the other from, in time and meaning, making sense of how they're connected in terms of cause and effect. All those things then require this kind of participatory imagination on the part of the reader. So reading comics is not, reading isn't ever really passive, but reading comics, I think, is a particularly non-passive form of reading because it requires this very active, imaginative process for readers. So the imagination that I needed in order to read comics was key to the imagination I needed to navigate a world that was changed, and that was also constantly reminding me of my difference, and my difference and my lesser value. Certainly, Germany was a place to be as an African-American person in the 1970s. Germans had an interesting relationship to race and to Blackness, but you never felt like you were part of the group. That was not something that was really happening. And so I was always aware of that difference. And that was something that, interestingly, superhero comics and Nubia particularly helped me with in a way. So another definition might be to say that imagining the world differently is what fantasy is. And that means imagining it differently than it appears to be to us in our collective sense of things. And one thing that might motivate seeing the world differently is recognizing that the world as it appears to be doesn't really welcome you. And so you'd want to imagine something different. And that kind of motivation, I think, is honed by superhero comics because superheroes are always involved in a fight for justice, right? So it's something they define as justice. And if Wonder Woman could identify men's sexist perceptions that she was not strong or she was not valuable, then in living my imaginative life with her for the length of time that I read a comic book or was entranced enough with it to kind of have come up with my own stories about her, I could identify the wrong and racist ways and of the world that I lived in. So that's the kind of autobiographical way of thinking about what was the impetus for the book. This is the theoretical account. So the theoretical account is I wanted to have an account of fantasy. So there's a dominant account of fantasy elaborated in psychoanalytic theories and their various derivations. And that account collectively tends to make little or no explicit reference to Blackness, Black presence, Black people, Black experiences, or doesn't generally reckon seriously with those things. And then on the flip side, much of psychoanalytic theory is founded, of course, upon the work of Sigmund Freud, and a lot of his speculations on pre-rational childhood existence, the gendering and sexualizing work of the Oedipus complex, the processes of sublimation and civilizing. A lot of these things depended in part or significantly upon European colonialists' reports about African, Asian, and indigenous American peoples. So in that sense, psychoanalytic accounts, even though they don't reckon with Blackness, are drenched in and inextricable from anti-Blackness. So that's one account. There's a less dominant but powerful account, which is best articulated, I think, by the work of Frantz Fanon, which points to how Blackness and Black presence are inventions of European enslavement and colonial conquest. And thus, Blackness is a kind of materialized phantasm. It's Blackness, Black people, their lives are, in a sense, as he exposes, European obsessions, nightmares that are realized in a cascade of historical injustices and acts of violence. So from the Fanonian point of view, fantasy is a significant part of what must be purged from Blackness for any possibility of being free. And then for Fanon, that goes further to say that Blackness itself, as the burdened bearer of the meaning of race in a world that's founded upon racialized slavery, has to be purged in this sort of completely reconstructed universe that he urges is needed in order to bring about the sort of new human. So in this book, I wanted to propose that we think of fantasy as neither drenched by nor purged of anti-Blackness, but as a mode of being Black that those dominant accounts of fantasy don't quite capture, or that those accounts can't wholly determine or clearly detect. And that way of thinking about fantasy is still founded upon Fanon to some degree, but it's Fanon in his engagement with Jean-Paul Sartre, and thus with the work of existential phenomenology. So one of Sartre's propositions is that consciousness defines being. So for Sartre, consciousness is what makes being itself, but consciousness, as he often says in the book Being in Consciousness, is not. He will have the phrase consciousness is not, by which he means that consciousness does not exist in a certain sense. That is, consciousness for him is something which arises as an act of a being who separates themselves from or transcends the world in which we are enmeshed. That is, all the sensorial data in which we're enmeshed, which we're really not separate from, but consciousness imagines this separation to say, oh, there's an I think, etc. And so for Sartre then, this consciousness is not, in the sense that it's not real in the same way that the sensorial data that the world that comprises the world that we live in is. And he's also kind of tracking the ways in which, of course, our perception is always highly limited, that it is narrow, that we're selecting particular data out of the whole range of that sensorial data. We're selecting particular things that we're taught to select by our experiences and by our pasts and our memories and by our cultures and by our parents, et cetera. So consciousness, therefore, is not, in the sense that it doesn't exist in the same way that the material world of the sensorial data does. It's not real. Consciousness is not a camera, not a recording device. We don't have any unmediated access to or exact recognition of the world. So I take that observation of Sartre's to think that consciousness is in a way fundamentally fantasy, especially if we define fantasy as the antithesis of reality, as what's not real. So with those kinds of ways of thinking as a foundation, if consciousness equals being, consciousness defines being, and consciousness also is, or can be described as fantasies which we experience as ourselves and our perceptions of reality, then the fantasy of a Superman or a Wolverine or a Storm in which we can immerse ourselves in reading a comic book exists on a continuum with the fantasy that, say, differences in skin color have to mean something, or the fantasy that we all in this room fully perceive everything that's going on in this room when we don't, right? There are millions of molecular processes that we don't perceive or can't perceive, particle waves, there's gravity, there are all these operation of foundational forces, all those things, not to mention countless thoughts and feelings, none of these things that we can really keep track of. We're always narrowing it down in terms of what we expect, et cetera. So that these things exist on a continuum with one another. So Superman, Wolverine, and the fantasies that we apprehend as reality exist on a continuum rather than being things that are antithetical. They're both being. So if the hierarchy between fantasy and reality, which we always assume there to be, I'm arguing that we always assume there to be a hierarchy between them, to be a distinction, and reality is more important than, better than, the thing we need to have more than fantasy. If we undercut or disarrange that hierarchy, we can see both as forms of being. And I think this is really well articulated by the late queer theorist and psychoanalytic critic from Berkeley here, Leo Bersani, who says this: psychic fantasy is a type of unrealized or derealized human and world being, which means that fantasy is both a figure for an act that may or may not be enacted. That is to say, it's unrealized, but it's unrealized being, right? Because again, consciousness is what defines being. And it's derealized in this sense that fantasy is indistinguishable from the creations of our minds, which we understand as memory, right? So that the past recedes from us, it's gone. 5 minutes ago is gone for us. We can only remember it, but we remember it not as a recording, but remember it as whatever we have decided to, or we've figured out a way to collect in our brains. And that is derealized being. So fantasy for him, psychic fantasy, is both unrealized being and derealized being. So I was interested in this book in tracking the ways that reading superhero comics from a Black queer perspective, my perspective, enables forms of being that act as counters to or reworkings of the fantasies of race, fantasies of sexuality, fantasies of gender, which structure our world as anti-Black, as misogynist, as transphobic, as homophobic, all of those things. So those are the ideas underlying the book. How much time do I have left? So I forgot to turn my thing on, so I'm not really sure. Like 5-10 minutes. Okay, so I'll read a little bit from the introduction. This is a part of the introduction where I'm talking about a story that Ursula Le Guin wrote. So Ursula K. Le Guin's provocative story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, published in 1973, is probably most often read as a discomforting riddle about the morality of utilitarianism. Omelas is a fantasy city or country where everyone lives happily. Unfortunately, this universal happiness depends upon the lifelong misery of one child. The causal relationship between the child's unhappiness and everyone else's commonplace ecstasy is never explained in the story, but arguably it's all the more convincingly realistic for its lack of explanation. Surely we expect happiness to be bought by someone's misery, no explanation needed, an assumption Le Guin cleverly begins to expose. What gets me excited about the story is the challenge that it throws down to our imagination. Describing the city or country of Omelas, Le Guin's narrator says this: As they did without monarchy and slavery, so they also got on without the stock exchange, the advertisement, the secret police, and the bomb. Yet I repeat that these were not simple folks, no dulcet shepherds, noble savages, bland utopians. They were not less complex than us. The trouble is that we have a bad habit, encouraged by pedants and sophisticates, of considering happiness as something rather stupid. Only pain is intellectual, only evil interesting. This is the treason of the artist, a refusal to admit the banality of evil and the terrible boredom of pain. If you can't lick them, join them. If it hurts, repeat it. But to praise despair is to condemn delight. To embrace violence is to lose hold of everything else. We have almost lost hold. We can no longer describe a happy man nor make any celebration of joy. So Le Guin's claim about the treason of art is harsh, and perhaps too harsh, I admit, if I take it up and make it into a critique of African-Americanist scholarship and African-Americanist writing and literature. But it's not wholly inapt in that case. Certainly regarding what we canonize and teach under the rubric African-American literature, the description does have a ring of truth. For a literature defined by the near unanimity of its voices agitating, analyzing, narrating, and narrativizing political projects of emancipation and anti-racism, too great an attention to delight and joy and happiness seems like a political betrayal. For us, only the description of injustice, torture, murder, intimidation, enslavement, dispossession is political, is exigent, is real. Yes, we can recognize and take seriously representational and analytical strategies of humor and satire, descriptions of resistant cultural practices, locations of temporary marronage. But who has described a Black happy person? In the light of harsh realities, who has the time? Who has the right? I'm so accustomed to investigating, if not exactly praising despair, pain, and evil, my first book was all about abjection, that if a description of Black happiness appeared somewhere, I missed it. And if it appeared somewhere, it was a challenge to the very conception of Black literature, what it is, how it must be structured to be recognized as Black literature, its justification and use, its distinction from mere luxury. And so it didn't count. The happiness Le Guin's treasonous artist cannot summon the intellect or interest to engage is for the Black writer a foolishness we can't afford to indulge. Black fantasy then might be aimed at snatching luxury where, as best we can see at any rate, there is none. It might be indulgent, foolish, frivolous, merely escapist, naively utopian, in some way wrong, inattentive to the real, defiant of the realist. Fantasy is generally understood on balance to be above all a misperception straying from accurate perception, and also therefore a misstep on the pathway to the correction of the problem, which obviously has to be accurately perceived in order to be solved. I'm interested in a reconstruction of the account of fantasy in its relationship to Blackness. I want to think of how fantasy engages and yet sidesteps the real problem that we think it poorly addresses. Viewed properly, my investigation is not a fantasy as a critique of the real, though fantasy does offer such critiques. My investigation, my fantasy about fantasy, is a fantasy as a mode of living and fantasy as the transformation of living and being. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next section is going to be led by Professor Lutula.
Thank you. Is the mic working okay? I'm excited to be here. Keeping it unreal is a beautiful reminder on why dreaming in the gutter can produce loving visions, transformative inspiration, active imagination, and empowering fantasy acts. Now, before reading Keeping It Unreal, I'm gonna take this off, is that okay? Okay. Now, before reading Keeping It Unreal, the gutter, for me, was a place I didn't want to go. It was a lowly groove that catches dirty water and litter on the street. When I was growing up as a Black girl, the last place you wanted to be was in the street and near a gutter. But the world of comics have given the gutter a new meaning for me. It's now a place or a space or a crack or an in-between, moving from one panel to another, that imagination, dreaming, and fantasy, acting as action can happen. Fantasy acts, Darieck tells us, have the potential to counteract anti-Blackness and neoliberal capitalism. He explains it, keeping unreal, Black fantasy realizes the possibles of Blackness that reality declares should not be, transforming irregular glimpses of a radical impossible that we know should be, and yet which, for the apparent sake of keeping it real, we refuse to know. Essentially, Darieck theorizes fantasy not to escape from material reality, but as a progression of productive acts against empire. Darieck's work is about disrupting white supremacy and the fantasy acts of refusal. There is a deep relation between fantasies we pay to read and perform, as Darieck puts it, and the fantasies we live by. Fantasy acts, Darieck theorizes, allows that fantasy is without the weight or carry or power of reality. But it also reminds us that fantasy has some accountable weight or power so that we have to call fantasy an act of some kind. Darieck is careful to add, but fantasy acts are also always dubious in the extent to which they involve consequential or real action, such that we might describe them as a minor form of doing. When I read this sentence, I immediately thought about what young people often say and what parents say when their children are adults. I'm doing me. That is, I'm caring for myself, even if you don't think I'm entitled to do so. I'm doing me. And here I will lean into Darieck's quoting of Essex Hemphill, to change the order of things to suit my desperations. I'm doing me is an act of self-love, but so much more. Darieck writes, it is not only the singular self that is transformed in the forge of such fantasies. The acts of such fantasies cannot be and are not confined solely to identification, but work their threads into wider nets of meaning. The fantasy act can also suggest being you, whomever that might be. Of course, Darieck tells us that anytime one invokes being, you're about to swim into the sea of theory. That includes Blackness as an antithetical term conferring the properties of being on what is not, that is whiteness, and that hence Blackness claim to being is constantly under erasure. Afro-pessimist thought draws upon this. Yet and still, this understanding of being doesn't account for our encounters with fantasy acts. Being of is also being of sensations and emotions. When Darieck, 8-year-old Darieck, saw the cover of Wonder Woman and her Black twin sister Nubia, it impacted him. Darieck writes, Nubia's image inaugurated and fed a hunger for a fantasy of Black power and Black beauty. Nubia's Black beauty and Black power invited him to fantasize. Nubia, girly girl, around the way, large hoop earrings, invite me to smile because they are familiar. I imagine that they had to be 24 karat gold and heavy in weight to the point that her pierced earlobe was elongated. Although I never read the 1972 Wonder Woman and Nubia comic book Face Off, I hope Nubia during the fight snatched them off her ears for a slicing and dicing weapon. I want a pair so that I can be just as fierce. I also want to imagine a world like Darieck that makes a powerful Black woman possible. And along with this, like Darieck, I want to imagine her presence in the real world and the wrongs that her power and beauty might right. Fantasy acts allow revision and refusal in an anti-Black world. Fantasy acts give us room to liberate our dreams. It can be almost impossible to dream if you're Black and understand how anti-Blackness functions and feels. Sometimes in class, I will ask my students to imagine what their perfect world looks like. After a long silence, it never fails, someone will critique the question and say something like, Black people don't have the privilege to play, to fantasize. But guess what? Eula Taylor, I now have the best comeback. It's the following. Darieck Scott tells us in Keeping It Unreal that Blackness marks you as the one fantasized about, the object of fantasy, subjected to and by fantasy, thus never empowered to fantasize. So are you, my students, going to let hegemonic culture stop you from envisioning something better? To dream, to fantasize, to imagine can actually be an activity that is partly the recovery of the possible, the action. A fantasy can be a pushback against anti-Blackness. I love that Darieck loves. It's so inspiring to read a book where love is evident, where the author is not squeamish about using the word love and lovely. Darieck tells us what he loves: comic books, beautiful clothes, perhaps a velvet camisole, delicious food, reading and learning about what he doesn't know. I must share that in preparing my comments, I wanted to go through all the quotes of the times that Darieck used the word love. I imagine it would be a list of pages, but when I began to go back through the text, it was I who repeatedly wrote on the margins, love it. My dialectical engagement with the text produced a cross-fertilization of love. I also loved Darieck's relationship to vocabulary, to words, and how he turns them over with wit and compassion. I think humor and love are sometimes undervalued in the Black radical tradition. Keeping it unreal underscores why reading comics can induce magical thinking and qualities of Blackness that love. Darieck's own desire for something better frames his perceptions of the fantasy drama genre. He says, I hate the world as it is, and I'm always looking, wishing for other worlds to go to. These places hold transformative imaginings for radical social change. By recalibrating the way we think of the radical Black tradition through comics, Darieck boldly advances debates in Black studies, media studies, comic studies, sexuality studies, queer theory, philosophy, and psychoanalysis. Equally important, by keeping it unreal, Darieck has shown us that his fantasy about fantasy makes us want to engage in fantasy acts because of their imaginative, super creative, and loving possibilities. Thank you.
Those are a couple of brutal acts to follow. Thank you both very much. My notes are a bit more of a jumble than what has been presented, and I've sort of been also scribbling on the fly as Ula and Darieck have been talking. First of all, I just want to echo what Ula said. I'm always going to be in praise of books that celebrate what the author loves, not in an uncritical way, not in a way that seems to imply that to love something is to be unable to be critical of it. I don't believe in such concepts as critical distance. I find them very counterproductive. I find that going all in and trying to, find your way through what it is that has helped make you through the process of the things that you love is important. And I think these are all things that are really central to this beautiful book. Yeah, that's all. A mutual colleague of ours, Ramzi Fawaz, has talked about superheroes a lot. And he came to my class once and he said something which I had never said to myself, but it's something that resonated right away for me, which is that for him, it never occurred to him growing up reading superhero comics that these were white masculine power fantasies. For him, they were not. And I feel very similarly about that, but I think he might have more credibility in that direction than I do. But I was there for something else, a corporeal imagination that I find strangely in places all over popular media. The malleability of the body, the possibility of having a different body. And this is in things that I love, like Daffy Duck and Looney Tunes cartoons, Jerry Lewis, digital avatars, superheroes, musical performers that go from walking to dancing or from talking to singing. Just this kind of transformative imagination that, again, is everywhere. And I have a lot of overlap. I feel a lot of overlap in reading Keeping It Real with Darieck's own attraction, even though mine is probably less historicized. My reference points, the scholars that I draw upon are different. And certainly my approach is less racially oriented. And I'm not queer, but I feel like my work is, if that makes any sense at all. Certainly the queerness of the superhero resonates with me incredibly. So some of the billion points of agreement that I felt, in my bones while reading Darieck's book. First of all, again, the urgency and reality of fantasy acts. That fantasy is, I think, first of all, just the whole introduction, the way it parses what fantasy is, what potential it holds, what fantasy is not, and what its burden is not. All of those things in his book are wonderful. And the idea that the superhero can be a very rich site of utopian fantasy. My point of reference, one of my points of reference is Richard Dyer's essay, Entertainment and Utopia, which is a very canonical essay about musicals. And in this, he writes about entertainment in general with musicals as his example. And he writes two of the taken for granted descriptions of entertainment as escape and as wish fulfillment point to its central thrust, namely utopianism. So I'm going to set a timer here, but I'm probably going to, oh well. Namely utopianism. Entertainment offers the image of something better to escape into, or something we want deeply that our day-to-day lives don't provide. He goes on to write, alternatives, wishes, hopes, these are the stuff of utopia, the sense that things could be better, that something other than what is can be imagined and may be realized. And rather than map out models of utopian worlds and explain how they're going to work, as utopian literature might do, entertainment presents, as Dyer writes, what utopia would feel like. They stage imaginative encounters with real world problems, and they are utopian, but they are not naive because they are utopian. Those are not synonymous terms. He stresses the idea of community in the musical, and there is something to community in the world of superheroes, be they fan communities, as Darieck mentioned, or teams that Ramsey writes about, like the New Mutants. But I think for me, the superhero's utopian affect is more fully expressed through each hero's unique embodiments. The hero villain doesn't matter to me, but their embodiments, the shape of their individual energy, which is a phrase that Leo Brody used with reference again to musical performers. The continuing, so the site of utopian possibility is the superhero body itself in all of the ways that it can be thought and imagined in its dynamic and flexible possibilities. And here is where, we begin to see the kind of gravity that this can take on. It's about more than just, when we think about Black superheroes, for example, it's more about just representing. It's more about what the body, it's about more than what the body seems to say, because what the individual can do in reading that body, in seeing that body, and engaging with that body, the possibilities are wide open. So in the case of Black superhero bodies, there's more at stake, even more at stake than balanced representation and moral positivity and the idea of a hero that looks like me, quote unquote. There's also the possibility that the body has to display power in the least radical or most radical of terms, the power to be seen. Which is why secret identity is my favorite power. The power to be seen when and how you choose to be. The power to fight, yeah, but the power to fight back. The power to imagine alternative ways of being and of being in the world. So it's not just about heroes that look like you, and I don't have the exact quote from Darieck's book, which made me bring this idea into play, but it's something that I found in his book. It's not only that there are heroes that look like me, but they are heroes that are allowed to exist in the world in ways that I am not, I, the fictional reader that I'm channeling here. The resistant body. In the Black Panther book, I do a lot of work with Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, kind of irresistible text to turn to because he also wrote Black Panther comics for a couple of years, good ones too. And I'm sure you know, it takes the form of it's an essay that takes the form of a letter to his son about the vulnerability of the Black male body in what he calls the American galaxy. The body in Between the World and Me is variously confined, fragile, breakable, destroyed, shackled, erased, shattered, contorted, beaten, raped, robbed, and pillaged. He describes the body as a body more fragile than any other in this country. And it's a body at mortal risk of destruction. How do I live free in this black body, Coates asked. What would it be to act as though my body were my own? And of course, we begin to immediately see then where the power of a black superhero comes into play, on levels well beyond white superheroes, the default of superheroes, whiteness. If black, female, and queer bodies share the attribute of being over-defined from without, the white gaze, the male gaze, the straight gaze that defines the object of that gaze, as writers like Frantz Fanon or Charles Johnson or Iris Marion Young all would have it, the utopian figure of the superhero can, be they black, female, queer, or whatever hero the reader invests with those kinds of qualities. These figures have some urgent work to do. So it's small wonder that that Coates would turn to writing superhero comics, a body that will not be so easily shackled or contained. Oh yeah, actually, I think I'm right here. Charles Johnson has this wonderful essay called Phenomenology in the Black Body. And he talks about this sense of being just pinned by the white gaze and white definition. And he says there are three ways out of this problem, this black as body problem that he talks about. Give me 1 second. I just skipped something that I didn't want to skip. All right, let me do that and then I'll come back. Sorry, so I said it was a jumble, so living up to my advanced billing. The first, he says, is to play the role of the empty black body, where he writes, not being acknowledged as a subject becomes my strength, my chance for cunning and masquerade, for guerrilla warfare. It's a kind of secret identity, sort of fly under the radar, not be noticed. Second, he says, involves performing against type. I display my eloquence, my culture, and my charm to demonstrate to the other that I, despite my stained skin, do indeed have an inside. And in this sense, you could say he's a superhero of social uplift, representing his people in that way. Or he says, I am radical and I seize the situation at its root by reversing the negative meaning of the body and therefore the black as body. It is beautiful, I say. Meaning still derives from the white other, but I applaud my athletic, amorous, and dancing ability, my street wisdom and savoir-faire, my soul. Performed correctly, one can even position the white body as an impoverished version. There's a challenge to pulling off this configuration, however. This persuasion in which stain and the black as body are inverted is ahistorical. It must involve a complete reconstitution of cultural meanings with the black body as its foundation. 2,000 years of color and symbolism must be recast. And as I write in my book, I say this last one sounds big. It sounds like it might take more than a hero to pull that one off. It might take a nation. And this is where Black Panther and Wakanda come so strongly into play. And Darieck writes not about the movie Black Panther in specific terms, but about the urgency of Wakanda as this place where these other ways of thinking can happen, literally licensed within that place. I'll finish up. I just had a couple of things that I wanted to point to. Is that okay? Do I have a minute or two? 1 minute. Okay. In other words, no. There's a section, the chapter in Darieck's book about Black superheroes, to me does one shift in that chapter. And I might be wrong about this, but there's a moment where you write more about what you think the creators of these comics were up to than you do in other chapters. And there are just some things that struck me about that it may put too much emphasis in this one part in your book on authorial intent, whether it's conscious or unconscious, which maybe ignores, it sounds way more pejorative than I mean it to, which doesn't take fully into account the ways that popular cultural forms are open to so many different interpretations and readings. I'll give one quick example and then I'll be out. Black Panther as African. This could be read as a brilliant tour de force on the part of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby to create a character in a country, on a continent that provides an alternate history in such profound ways. Or it could have been an attempt to avoid putting a Black superhero on the streets of America, where issues of civil rights and the problems of Black people in America would have to be front and center. Or Luke Cage's Bulletproof Body may speak to the criminality of the Black superhero backstory, but it also, in 2016, when it was made into a TV show, his bulletproof skin became such a resonant metaphor, his shot up hoodie as an icon of violence against Black bodies at that time. So I just wanted to put that out there, that I think this book is so strong when it completely leans into the idea that it is the reader, the viewer, the fantasizer who can take these materials and do so much with them, and do so much with them with these acts of fantasy, these fantasy acts that have such continuing power. That's where I'll leave it.
Change the format if you want.
Yes, I think I will, because I don't have 10 minutes of response, but I thank you both for those really wonderful comments. And again, thank you for the generosity of reading the book and engaging with it so wonderfully. I honestly, Eula, I was touched by how you read through my love, that you were paying attention to that. And that, I think that was such an animating force for me in writing the book. I guess a few things. You used the word refusal, which I think is a big part of how I'm thinking about fantasy, and that for me is informed, in part by, there's a group of scholars that I belong to, that your friend Sadia Hartman, Tina Campt, and others are, Christina Sharp, that started up being called Practicing Refusal. And I think I learned a lot about that concept in some ways through them, from them. But I think when I think about refusal, particularly when it comes to fantasy, I think about where you put your attention. It's that when you're refusing to pay attention to what is given to you that you're supposed to pay attention to, or that you're supposed to pay attention to, countering the idea of Black inferiority, for example, as Charles Johnson is talking about the ways that you're pinned by, Scott, that you mentioned, that you're pinned by the white gaze. All those are responses to that very prevalent, if not ubiquitous idea of Black inferiority. But the fantasy would be about refusing to engage with that. Like, I'm not going to constantly be drawn into this battle. I'm going to pay attention to something different. And it will be something not fully unrelated, but it is something different perhaps, which these superheroes may provide an opportunity to consider. And another thing that I was thinking about as you both were talking had to do with a part of what I wanted to say in the book, or what I do try to say, is that the real is really realisms. That is, realism is the real. That is, the real isn't real. It's the real is what's packaged for us as realism, that then masquerades as the real. And so that there was kind of an undercurrent of some things that both of you were saying that made me want to reiterate that, because I thought that was part of what you were talking about. And I also loved, Scott, that what you were talking about, that idea of the power to fight back. That was a nice phrasing that I enjoyed. I think that Scott, when you were talking about the idea that I was spending a lot of time on Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and what they were thinking about with Black Panther, I don't think, I wasn't thinking about it in terms of, it wasn't that I felt that the viewer or the reader wasn't important, since obviously that's what most of the book is about. But I did want to, in that chapter, I was trying to trace the various ways that there are limitations that are inherent to this figure, right? That it is a figure that participates in the imagination of anti-Blackness, It does other things, which I obviously, as a reader of it or as a viewer of it, do with it. But it was important to me to trace the limitations that are part of the conception of the character itself, even though I'm fully free to do whatever I want to do as a reader with it, which people obviously did with this Nubia figure, as I said, because suddenly 50 years later we've got these comic books that are that put Nubia in the center, and she's now become queen of the Amazons, and she's a reconstituted character. So that was what I was thinking about. It was just more this it was partly feeling like I really need to acknowledge the gravity of an Afro-pessimist point of position, which would be that anti-Blackness is so pervasive, there's no escape, there's no working with it, it always returns to the same thing. And there are lots of aspects of all of those characters that have baked in kind of anti-Black concepts. And the superhero as concept has baked into it a great deal of white supremacy, as Alan Moore, I quoted him in the book, goes on to say. Alan Moore, who was a writer of many important comics, from Watchmen to a bunch of other things, V for Vendetta. So I think that's what I was trying to think about in that respect. So, but that's my response.
Okay, so that leaves us time for some questions, and we do have some questions online. I just want to acknowledge that we had some 37 or so listeners online as well, so the room was really full, and that's powerful, and I appreciate you all listening online. And so there is a question I can read on, a question in the room that I want to start with. Does anybody have a burning question that they want to start with? No? Yeah, okay, I'll read the one. So there's a person named Chero Johnson says, thank you for a wonderful talk. My question is about the academic work we do here, the pressures of tenure, graduating, getting a degree as structural and social imperatives to grow up and leave frivolous play and fantasy behind. In other words, how do you square work and play in your own life and scholarly practice, say fantasy acts that is never ending, yet the tenure clock is always ready, pressing? So that's a great question, and I'm curious, very curious about that answer as well. Do you still read comics?
I do still read comics.
Yeah. Yes.
And that's a great question. And I guess a couple of things. One, I can say this about my own trajectory as a scholar. So when I was a graduate student in modern thought and literature at Stanford, I was studying African-American literature and published 2 articles while I was a graduate student. One of them was in GLQ, which was about, well, we don't need to talk about that. But, yeah, we'll get into that one. But the other one was about Love and Rockets, which is a comic book in the Americas Review. So, which is a comic book that I love, that was motivated by my love for it. My dissertation director was expert scholar in Chicano studies, and so I drew on him to write about Love and Rockets, which is written by the brothers Hernandez. So I started off in my scholarship interested in comics, and then just with the very pressures that you, the questioner, are talking about, went away from it because I felt like I got to really do serious stuff here, and I love the serious stuff too, and I love Frantz Fanon, and was the beginning of lots of thinking for me for Extravagant Objection. But then when that was over, and the tenure clock had run, and I got tenure, I found myself going back to comics, and my colleague Lee Rayford asked me to go to give a talk in Germany with her about visual culture, and comics was an easy way for me to get into that, and that just became the basis and the beginning for this this book. So, I mean, it's there's no getting around the fact that in some ways there's a sort of uphill fight, as it were, to talk about these kinds of things and have them recognized. But on the other hand, there's a huge group of people who are comic studies scholars, and it's become more and more a part of the academy, for better or worse. And so I would encourage you to be able to think about those things. And one can think seriously about play. I think people do think seriously about it, and it's worth thinking seriously about and producing scholarship about. So I guess that's my answer. And I don't think there's any, one size fits all answer to that, but that's the way it's worked for me.
Yeah, thank you. And may I follow up? Is there a place to play for play's sake? Or do you have to kind of, instrumentalize all your play for the next book?
I didn't get to instrumentalize it at all. I mean, it wasn't as though I thought I'm doing all this, that I'm finally going to write some scholarship about comics. It was more, I was just driven to do it by my own love of it. So it was more about the writing about what I loved than it was about the desire to produce something that would be recognized by the Academy.
So pure, yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful, thank you. Any other questions? Claudia?
Thank you so much, first of all, for easily the most inspiring panel I've heard in a really, really long time. So thank you so much. It's really moving on many levels. Claudia von Bacano, and I'm the executive director of the Social Sciences D-Lab, but in a previous life, I worked as an illustrator. And so the visual form and narrative is a huge passion of mine. And so this is all really inspiring and bringing a lot of things together. And as a queer woman of color and a fan girl of Los Hermanos Hernandez and just a whole corpora of like different graphic novels, this is really all fascinating. I have a couple of questions. One is, I've started to delve into your book and I started to kind of look into the queerness aspects of it. A very general question, if you could speak a little bit more to the queer dimension that you speak to in the book. And the second one is kind of going a little bit deeper into what you've already touched upon, which is this huge contradiction. I like superhero comics to a certain extent. Electra Assassin is an early one that I really enjoyed. But also I'm super repelled by them, right? For all the reasons you talk about, which is they're very sexist, they're very misogynist, they're sort of have this white, they kind of make everything into a white kind of landscape. So that contradiction and how you grapple with that contradiction is the second question. Thank you so much.
Oh, great question. Thank you. So queerness, so I guess there are two ways that I think about it in relationship to the subject of the book, which is mostly superhero comics. One of them is essentially following Ramsey Fawaz's way of thinking about it, which is that queerness, insofar as it's about non-normativity, that superhero comics in particular are all about non-normativity. That is, every body, as Scott was talking about, is a non-normative body, from characters like the Thing, especially, that are completely transformed into things that were what we would now call sort of post-human or non-human figures, even to those who are more human, but are kind of a figure of humanity that is not the everyday. So there's that level at which they're non-normative and queer. I also spent a lot of time talking about the way in which superheroes particularly always have about them and within their representation and in the stories told about them from the 1940s forward, a suppressed, but always bubbling over the top sort of queer sexual content that is, from Wonder Woman, where it's a lot more upfront, to others that you'd consider to not even be queer characters, that there's the very fixation on the body and the particular ways in which the stories unfold have a lot of queer content. And then I kind of connected this to queer erotic comics and how they take that and how a lot of particularly gay male cartoonists start by being interested in superheroes and drawing superhero male bodies, and then draw erotica based on that. So those are the two ways that I kind of work with it in the book. And so that for me, there is a sense in which both the content of the comics has a queerness that, as you were talking about, also you're always having to, that's often being suppressed. And like the Comics Code Authority, which came into place after, I guess, when was it, the late 1950s, early 1960s, that said that you couldn't say anything about homosexuality, like all of that. There's always a kind of fight that's going on with what's represented on the page and the reader when it comes to wanting to read queerness in them. But I try to trace that and think about that. The second question is related to that. How do you reconcile, I guess is what you're asking. I don't think there is a reconciliation. I think it's always a question of reading. There was a phrase that Bell Hooks used to use. I think she called it reading oppositionally. And I think I'm always doing that. I don't know that I would quite phrase it in that sense, because that seems very much like you're just sort of fighting the text all the time. But for me, it's more that you take the parts of the work that touch you, and they become templates for you to spin off in your own way. For me, I think I often think about it's like it's almost like a trampoline. You get on it and get this picture of Nubia, and then I start jumping way off where she is to where I want her to be, or to how I invest in her. And that I don't have to do that with Love and Rockets, because that was just, that was just the stuff. But I need to do that with Wonder Woman and all these other characters, as you say, because there are all kinds of white supremacist, misogynist, homophobic aspects which structure the representation of them.
Go ahead.
Just to add on to that, another thing that I very much like about your whole approach is that you are invested in aspects of comics that are not centered on narrative. And narrative so often is providing the framework that takes things from one point to another point and tells you what you're supposed to think about those things. But you can feel free to just jettison that, to respond to an image on a cover with a costume that shows up nowhere else ever, but which is nevertheless something for you. So yeah, any approaches I find to film studies, comic studies, that downplays narrative in favor of those non-narrative elements that just can float more freely for the reader, I think is a great thing in your book, about your book.
Let's see if there's any more questions. Yes, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. It was just a pleasure to hear about the book. One of the things I was actually thinking about quite a bit is how this is really, the work seems to be evoking, especially through the utility of the theoretical framework of fantasy acts, disability studies and madness studies. Because what I was hearing a lot and listening to you talk about the work is how, especially, and I appreciate the attention to the materiality of how, these objects, comic books, script us to engage with them in particular ways. And in that way, it kind of brings us to the hinterlands between the material and the immaterial. But my question is, I wonder, whether in the book or from generative material within the book, how does it affect this framework of fantasy act when we perceive the fantasy as not a choice, meaning in madness studies? Because I think there is something really interesting to me about, with comic books, we're engaging and we're producing the fantasy perhaps immaterially in our minds, but based on a material object. But I wonder if this concept also carries some weight and is generative in thinking about those kind of fantasies that we often perceive. And I think of Octavia Butler, who's suggesting that the smoother the interface between the worlds, the more sane we're perceived to be. So I know it's quite a kind of wandering question, but it wasn't fully fleshed out, because in many ways I was just thinking with you, and it really provoked interesting ideas for me in thinking about scholars like Sammy Schock's work and Octavia Butler's work as well. So thank you.
That's a really interesting question that I don't know that I have an answer to. I guess in part you're asking about, is there a way of thinking about fantasy acts in relationship to what we think of as madness, right? And it is difficult in a certain sense, because my first thought is there is a kind of, as I'm talking about fantasy acts, I'm talking about particularly the phenomenology of reading comics and superhero comics, there is an importance to the volitional, right? There's importance to the will and to the consciousness of one's desire. But insofar as madness is a manifestation of what we call madness, is a manifestation of desires that are not sanctioned, perceptions that are not in keeping with realisms, which masquerade as the real, I think it does have application, right? Insofar as, because I think it doesn't, I didn't think about this until you asked the question, but in some ways it doesn't require the volitional, right? That it's a way of describing an engagement with material or immaterial images, narratives, or whatever, that brings you into relationship to something which is not prescribed for you as the mode of living. So, yeah.
There is one more question online. May we spend a minute on it? It's an interesting and very broad question. I think there's many different kinds of comics that do many different kind of things, but Linda Leon wants to know, do you see the role of comics as genre, which leads what society could and should be thinking of? Or rather, do comics simply follow social constructs as a reflection of societal and racial trends?
I think they are definitely, there's no way I could make an argument that comics are some sort of production creation that steps outside of society. I mean, in a sense, I mean, everything, I mean, whatever we're calling society, the world that in which we're enmeshed is a product of it in some fashion. So I think it is a product, and it often is also, this is why I was paying attention a little bit to Stan Lee or whatever the kind of thinking is. It is also sometimes reproducing or intentionally reproducing certain kinds of, like racism or anti-Blackness and misogyny, et cetera. But again, that doesn't determine what the readers and communities of readers and adapters, like I talked a lot about, about the film's adaptation of what Stan Lee and Jack Kirby did, that what they do with it. So, but they're also within society, as it were. So if the question is that, is it something that gets you outside? I didn't want to try to say that. I do want to say though that it reworks things, or potentially reworks things that are in a productive way that doesn't have to be tethered to the hard and fast rules that we're generally that are prescribed for us.
So another vote for fantasy.
Yeah.
Right. So thank you so much. We're going to conclude the panel. And do you have a copy of the book here so we can hold it up? There's the picture moment. If you have any books that you want signed, do it. Congratulations on publishing this book and taking us on this wonderful journey.
Thank you.